All right. Hey, good evening, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. Again, we're going to be in Daniel chapter 4, and we're going to be on our notes. I forget what page exactly, but I put the link there. If you didn't have last week's notes, you can download them at our church website there at the link, and then print those out or fill those along. If you want to download it as a Word document and fill those out on your computer as you go, you can do that as well. Let me go ahead and share my screen. But I really, tonight, as I'm kind of getting this screen ready, I want to go ahead and read Nebuchadnezzar's dream again. And so let me go ahead and pull this up here. Here we go. Here we go. Can everyone see that screen okay?
Looks good.
Okay.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. Okay. So before we get into the slides here, let's go ahead and read Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Remember, this is the second dream recorded for Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel. The first one was in Daniel chapter 2. It was a dream of a statue comprised of different types of metals. The head of gold in that statue represented Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom. But then there were three other kingdoms represented at three other different parts of the body. And then as we get down to kind of the fourth kingdom, the fifth kingdom was really a combination of clay and iron in the toes and the feet and the toes, which represents a revived Roman Empire. And then you've got the kingdom from heaven, which is an eternal kingdom that will crush and break into pieces all these other kingdoms. And so that was the dream given to Nebuchadnezzar. That was, if you recall, kind of reflected the times of the Gentiles. In chapter 4, God is dealing with Nebuchadnezzar on a much more personal level due to his pride, which was due to his success as a king. And that success was solely credited to God. And we kind of looked at that last week in Jeremiah, where God is the one who raised Nebuchadnezzar to preeminence and power. And it was God who gave him the kingdom, and God who put every other nation under him and really gave him a world empire. But Nebuchadnezzar took credit for it, had extreme pride basically in taking credit for that. And so this is the dream that God gives him, and Nebuchadnezzar is very disturbed by this. And so in verse 10, let's pick up in verse 10. Let's just kind of read this again, and then we'll jump into this evening's section. But verse 10 says, "These were the visions of my head while on my bed. I was looking, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew and became strong. Its height reached to the heavens, and it could be seen to the ends of all the earth. Its leaves were lovely, its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it. The birds of the heavens dwelt in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it." Now, as we said last week, and as we looked at last week, this tree represents Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom, the Babylonian kingdom. And it became a worldwide empire of which everyone was dependent upon their leadership. And they all benefited because he was benefiting. He was successful, so everyone else benefited from that. And that's kind of what's represented there in verses 10 through 12. But then in verse 13, it says, "I saw in the visions of my head, while on my bed, there was a watcher, a holy one coming down from heaven." And we kind of described this person, kind of worked through, basically determined this was an angel, okay, a messenger. And we can see that he gives a message. In verse 14, he cried aloud and said thus, "Chop down the tree and cut off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts get out from under it and the birds from its branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump and roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze, in the tender grass of the field. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let him graze with the beast on the grass of the earth." And so what we kind of just said there is he's saying, chop down the tree, cut off its branches. In other words, destroy the kingdom, destroy Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom, strip off its leaves, scatter its fruit. In other words, make it non-useful to everybody else. And then let the beasts get out from under it and the birds from its branches. In other words, where these other nations aren't going to be dependent on the empire of Babylon anymore. Because as we saw from Daniel chapter 2, his kingdom is not an everlasting kingdom. It would be given over to the Medo and Persians. And then we also saw in Jeremiah that would happen during the time of Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. So again, it was a temporary kingdom, very successful kingdom, but the watcher is describing this. But what's really interesting is at the end of verse 15, this is really going to kind of lead into the rest of the passage this evening. Notice he switches metaphors here. Okay, it was a tree bound with the root, the stump and the roots were bound with a band of iron and bronze. In other words, limiting its future growth, but also allowing for the potential for it to grow back because the stump is still in the ground. But then notice the metaphor switch in verse 15. In the tender grass of the field, let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let him graze with the beast on the grass of the earth. Verse 16, let his heart be changed from that of a man. Let him be given the heart of a beast, and let 7 times pass over him. See how they shifted from a tree to now they've personified this person who's going to suffer. This is a him. Okay, it was a tree, it wasn't it. Now it's a him. And notice his heart is going to be changed from that of a man, verse 16. And then let him be given the heart of a beast, and let 7 times pass over him. Okay, so now we're talking specifically about Nebuchadnezzar, and we're going to see that that's an accurate interpretation as we go forward in chapter 4. But notice verse 17, this decision is by the decree of the watchers, and the sentence by the word of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whomever he will, and sets over it the lowest of men. And so why is God going to judge Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom? It's right there in verse 17. In order that's for the purpose of the living may know something. And what does God want all living to know? This is everybody part of the Babylonian kingdom. This is the Jews who are in exile in Babylon. This is the entire world. What does God want them to know? He wants them to know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. It has nothing to do with where the pagans thought that if your God was more powerful than my God, then I could never defeat you in battle. That had nothing to do with it. The Most High God, the only God, sometimes allowed his people to be disciplined, and disciplined to the extreme of being put into exile under the rule of another kingdom to draw them back to himself. But he wants them to know that even when he does that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. He will give it to whomever he will, which is in the case of Nebuchadnezzar. He gave Nebuchadnezzar this worldwide reign. We saw that in Jeremiah. And he sets it over the lowest of men. Now, you remember that passage in Jeremiah. Let's see if I can find it here. I think it's Jeremiah 27 in verse 5. Jeremiah 27 verse 5. I have made the earth, the man and the beast that are on the ground, by my great power and by my outstretched arm, and have given it to whom it seemed proper to me. And now I have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant. And the beasts of the field I have also given him to serve him. And so you can see how the beast appearing in this dream fits with this concept that God has given him his kingdom. Verse 7, so all nations shall serve him, and his son and his son's son, there's his grandson, until the time of his land comes, and then many nations and great kings shall make him serve them. And it shall be that the nation and kingdom which will not serve Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon, and which will not put its neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon, that nation I will punish, says the Lord, with the sword, the famine, the pestilence, until I have consumed them by his hand. And so we see that God was the reason that Nebuchadnezzar was so successful. Nebuchadnezzar just didn't realize that. And so in verse 18, we read this dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now you, Belteshazzar, which is Daniel's Babylonian name, declare its interpretation, since all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known to me the interpretation, but you are able, for the Spirit of the Holy God is in you. And so that kind of brings us up to speed of where we left off last time. And so now we want to look at this section, section 19 through 27, section 19 through 27. And this is really Daniel giving the interpretation of the dream to Nebuchadnezzar, but he's almost giving it reluctantly. In fact, notice what he says in verse 19. Then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished for a time. and his thoughts troubled him. So the king spoke and said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its interpretation trouble you. Belteshazzar answered and said, My lord, may the dream concern those who hate you, and its interpretation concern your enemies. And so God's message through this dream deeply distressed Daniel. But again, the king reassured him. God's projections are not always cheerful. Sometimes we see in the Bible, and in fact, God is always honest with us, but sometimes his messages or his projections are not always cheerful. You know, we were even talking in Sunday school today how we're called to suffer as believers. That's not a cheerful message for believers. We would love to hear that we'll never suffer when we become Christians, but that's just not the truth. And so God is true, and he's going to give this interpretation through Daniel that's not a very pleasant interpretation. And so when the text says that Daniel was astonished, it means to be greatly perplexed or bewildered, with the focus on mental confusion. And then the word troubled, it says his thoughts troubled him. Troubled means frightened, alarmed, or terrified. And so apparently Daniel's internal feelings were broadcast externally because Nebuchadnezzar notices it and encourages Daniel to tell him. It's almost like he can see in Daniel's face that Daniel doesn't want to say what he knows. And Nebuchadnezzar has to encourage him, just speak. No, don't let it trouble you. I need to know what it's saying. And so Daniel tells him that even though he knows the ominous predictions are for Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel sensitively tells the king, I wish the interpretation was for your enemies, king, and not you. And it's kind of an interesting comment here by Daniel, because I think it shows at some level that Daniel had grown to care about King Nebuchadnezzar, even though he was a pagan unbeliever, even though he had ripped him from his home as a teenager and took him into exile some, probably 20, 25 years earlier, and probably whose very lifestyle Daniel was disgusted by, because the pagans were involved in all sorts of things that would have really upset the serious Jew of the day. But there was a care and a concern for Nebuchadnezzar here. And he says, man, I wish that the interpretation, the dream, was about your enemies, not for you, O king. And so in verses 20 through 22, Daniel, we'll see, is going to clearly identify the tree in Nebuchadnezzar's dream as Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom rule. In fact, let's read verses 20 through 22. Daniel says, the tree that you saw, which grew and became strong, whose height reached to the heavens, and which could be seen by all the earth, whose leaves were lovely, and its fruit abundant, in which was food for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and whose branches the birds of the heaven had their home. It is you, O king, who have grown and become strong, for your greatness has grown and reaches to the heavens, and your dominion to the end of the earth. And so the imagery that's brought forth with the tree could be noted in the following ways. As Nebuchadnezzar grew stronger, he also grew increasingly arrogant. And we're going to see in this dream that his pride would be his own undoing. In fact, we're going to see that his pride was at a level that was that borderline, proud, arrogant intensity. And we'll talk about that as we kind of get into the applying of the dream when that kind of happens. We also saw that the dream in number 2 showed that Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom had indeed become a refuge for many peoples. This blessing of others should have made the king humble and caring rather than proud. In fact, when you think about it, in the grand scheme of things, success should always produce humility if it's being viewed from a divine perspective. If it's not, if it's being viewed from a human perspective, we tend to take more credit for things than we should take credit for, and that's how we become proud. But oftentimes, and in fact, I would say often, maybe most of the time, it seems, success becomes a step to someone's undoing. It actually becomes a step toward failure. And this is what we're going to see in the life of Nebuchadnezzar. His success did not produce humility. It did not give him an understanding of, wow, I'm not this good. I must have some divine help here. Or, boy, this is the God of Israel blessing me here. He just had no recognition of that. He was taking credit for everything that was going well. Additionally, this image of the tree describes Nebuchadnezzar's influence like that of an overarching tree whose branches extend far and wide, giving abundant food to all under its shadow. Truly his kingdom from all external valuation was highly successful. If you asked anybody what a successful kingdom looked like, they would point to Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, because from everything externally, it looked like he was extremely successful. And so in verse 23, Daniel is going to identify the watcher. He says, inasmuch as the king saw a watcher, a holy one, okay, again, that could fit the description of an angel, coming down from heaven and saying, chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave its stump and roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze in the tender grass of the field. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let him graze with the beasts of the field till 7 times pass over him. So he's just kind of repeating the dream here. Again, as we mentioned last week, the Babylonian word watcher, the one that's translated watcher, was a word that was used of government informants whose job was to covertly gather information throughout the kingdom and then report back to the king. In this case, the angelic watcher demanded that Nebuchadnezzar be cut down, and we can kind of see that tone in verse 14, right? He cried aloud and said thus, chop down the tree and cut off its branches, strip off its leaves, scatter its fruit. So he's definitely demanding that Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom be cut down, taken down, clipped, if you will. And again, as we looked in verse 17, this judgment was so that everyone would know that God alone reigns, that God alone installs kings and kingdoms as he considers best. And so this judgment on Nebuchadnezzar, as we've said before, had a very specific purpose from God. And it shows Daniel and the nation of Israel, once again, that God is still in control over all nations, even though they're in exile. And again, this would have been very encouraging to know that God intended to fulfill his promises to the nation, that even their discipline and exile could not destroy those promises. And so he's showing them these things along the way during their 70 years under exile, under Babylon, and then eventually Medo-Persia. And so finally in verse 24, we get to Daniel's interpretation of the dream. And he clarifies what's going to happen to the king. And this actually tells us why Daniel was so distressed, as we saw back in verse 19. So let's read verse 24 and 25. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king. They shall drive you from men, your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make you eat grass like oxen. They shall wet you with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he chooses. Okay, so Nebuchadnezzar, we learn here, would be driven away from mankind, and his dwelling place would be with the beasts of the field. Not in his comfortable home, not in his comfortable bed, and not with his comfortable food and service. Now, could you imagine Daniel having to communicate this gloomy and very odd warning to the most powerful man on earth, who was his boss? From a human level, this is what we would call career suicide. You don't want to deliver bad news to your boss, right? You don't want to tell him that something terrible is going to happen to him. That tends to reflect poorly on you. And yet Daniel had to give him this message. And notice a couple things about the interpretation of judgment. Number one, God had a very specific timetable for this judgment. It was 7 times. It was not an indefinite punishment. This, just the fact that this was a temporary punishment, and it was also conditioned. Notice that he says this, 7 times shall pass over you till you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. So God is desiring to bring Nebuchadnezzar to a knowledge of himself, and he's using this really as a temporary punishment to bring about that understanding. Again, God had a very specific lesson he wanted to teach Nebuchadnezzar, and the lesson was this: God, not Nebuchadnezzar and not any other man, rules supreme over all the earth. And Nebuchadnezzar needed to remember this and not forget it. He didn't need to let his pride go to his head in this situation. And then third, God is the only one who made Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom so successful, even though Nebuchadnezzar thought it was all him. And see, Nebuchadnezzar needed to know this. Look at the very end of verse 25. Not only does the Most High rule in the kingdom of men, but he gives it, the rule, to whomever he chooses. And this is what we saw in Jeremiah 27, verses 5 through 8. The reason Nebuchadnezzar was so successful was because God gave him that success. And see, he was going to use this judgment of Nebuchadnezzar to reveal that to him. So you can see in so many ways, this is a gracious judgment on King Nebuchadnezzar. This is really getting his attention. This is proving, if you will, God's existence, Yahweh's existence, and the fact that Yahweh is all powerful in the kingdom of men. And so in 426, we're going to see that God decreed that Nebuchadnezzar would suffer a 7-year judgment, but he gave him a promise of restoration when he would finally accept God as the one and only sovereign. Let's read verse 26. And inasmuch as they gave the command to leave the stump and roots of the tree, your kingdom shall be assured to you after you come to know that heaven rules. And so you see God even in this promise. You're going to be disciplined, you're going to be judged, but I'm not going to completely destroy your kingdom. I'm going to give it back to you. And that's kind of what was represented by leaving the stumps and the roots of the tree. And so as pointed out before, it's interesting to notice the use of the word heaven to describe where true rule and reign originate. By Daniel, he is a continual witness of this fact. In fact, notice the very last phrase there in verse 26. He says, after you come to know that heaven rules. He's talking about the God of heaven. And then follow me real quick. We've got those cross references there on the screen. But go to Daniel 2:28. See, again, Daniel is a constant witness of the God of heaven. 2:28, but there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. Daniel 2:37, you, O king, are a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field and the birds of the heaven, he has given them into your hand and has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold. Does this sound familiar? It should. This is exact wording we're seeing in Daniel chapter 4. Daniel had told Nebuchadnezzar too that the God of heaven had given this authority to him. And by the time we get to Daniel chapter 4, some 25 years later, 25 years later, he still has not made the connection. Look at Daniel 2:44. And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. And then even in 523, in the very last night of the Babylonian kingdom, we see this, that Daniel speaking to Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, and you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear and know, and the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. But again, notice how he identifies him as the Lord of heaven. So Daniel provides a clear and continual witness of the fact that the God of heaven reigns. What's really also interesting and fascinating is to observe these pagan kings begin to describe Yahweh as the God of heaven and the King of heaven as well. And so what we see by that is Daniel's witness at some points in time were well received. In fact, let's look at a couple of these. Daniel 4:37. This is at the end of our story this evening. But Daniel 4:37, notice Nebuchadnezzar, what he says. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all of whose works are truth and his ways justice, and those who walk in pride he is able to put down. And then flip back with me to the book of Ezra. This is very interesting because Ezra is recorded during the time of the Medo-Persian Empire, which followed the Babylonian Empire and followed the loss of that empire by Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. We'll get to that in chapter 5 of Daniel. But in Ezra, this is the decree of the Medo-Persian kings. Look at Ezra 6 verses 9 through 10. And notice this, they've picked up on this concept of Yahweh as the God of heaven, the King of heaven. Look at Ezra again, 6:9. And whatever they need, young bulls, rams, and lambs for the burnt offerings of the God of heaven, wheat, salt, wine, and oil, according to the request of the priests who are in Jerusalem, let it be given them day by day without fail, that they may offer sacrifices of sweet aroma to the God of heaven and pray for the life of the king and his sons. Jump over to Ezra 7:21. And it says, and I, even I, Artaxerxes, the king, issue a decree to all the treasurers who are in the region beyond the river, that whatever Ezra the priest, the scribe of the law of the God of heaven, may require of you, let it be done diligently. And then jump down to verse 23. Whatever is commanded by the God of heaven, let it diligently be done for the house of the God of heaven. For why should there be wrath against the realm of the king and his sons? And so you see that Daniel's witness in this continual way in which he's pointing out that heaven rules, as he says in Daniel 4:26, it actually starts to trickle down into the thinking of the kings in these world empires that will follow and has Israel in exile. Now in verse 27, we see that it reads this, therefore, O king, let my advice be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by being righteous and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. Perhaps there may be a lengthening of your prosperity. And so Daniel spoke the truth in love to his king, and he gave him the best advice possible. In fact, he pled with Nebuchadnezzar to flee from a life of sin and to live righteously. You know, one of the requirements of a king in these ancient times, this was true in the nation of Israel, is oftentimes they were a judge. They were the final judge of legal and civil matters in their country. And so they didn't need to cater to the rich and take advantage of the poor. They needed to give justice to everybody. And so Daniel gives him a very practical example of this, living righteously by commanding him to treat the poor with compassion. Again, for a king, the poor was the group of people that could do nothing for him, offer him nothing, and yet he needed to treat them with justice and compassion, just as if they had the most money in the kingdom. Now, Daniel was careful not to promise Nebuchadnezzar that God would withhold judgment from him, because Daniel didn't know God's will in this situation. But he did promise an extension to the period of his prosperity if he changed his heart and departed from his evil ways. In other words, he promised that God may delay the judgment. He didn't promise that God would withhold or take it away, but he said maybe he would delay it and allow his prosperity to be lengthened. But notice he's careful about what he promises there. And unfortunately, as we will see, Nebuchadnezzar did not take Daniel's advice to heart. And this is such a great example biblically of someone giving loving and sound biblical advice, and then the person who receives the advice thinking that they know better, or they don't believe that the consequences will ever be as bad as what the person is telling them. And so what a great example when someone is giving loving and sound biblical advice. Each one of us should respond gratefully and respond in whatever way that we can, not just ignoring their counsel or their warning, or not just blowing off what they're saying. But Nebuchadnezzar does that, as we're going to see. And so we're going to look now at the unfortunate fulfillment. That's kind of a neat picture online I found of, Nebuchadnezzar. They're rendering what he may have looked like during this time. But Daniel 4:28 through 33 is the unfortunate fulfillment of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And so in verse 28, let's go ahead and read verses 28 through 30. And it says, all this came upon Nebuchadnezzar. Unfortunately, everything that the dream said would happen, happened. At the end of the 12 months, he was walking about the royal palace of Babylon. The king spoke, saying, is not this great Babylon that I have built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power and for the honor of my majesty? And you could just see in that statement how arrogant and proud he is. It's about I and I did this, and it was because of me. And you can see that's what's going to get him obviously in trouble. It's going to kick this judgment into gear. So before we consider the execution of the judgment of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, notice the absolute grace and mercy of Yahweh. First of all, he graciously gave Nebuchadnezzar, I don't know if you noticed that, he gave him 12 months to change his mind. But instead he maintained his arrogance. In fact, based on verse 30, he may have even grown in his arrogance. During that 12-month period, he may have gotten even more successful. He may have finished some additional projects that he had been working on and thought even more highly of himself. And so God is being super gracious and merciful even with this pagan king. Now, by the time he is saying this, when he's describing this in verse 30, when he gets so arrogant, this is actually, just to put it in context, this is 4 years following the destruction of Jerusalem and the final of 3 deportations of the nation of Judah. Remember, in 586 BC, that was the year that Nebuchadnezzar went back into Judah. He destroyed the city of Jerusalem. He destroyed Solomon's temple. He took all of the temple artifacts with him back to Babylon, and he completely destroyed and took all of the remaining Jews into exile. So this is 4 years after the fact. So he's probably feeling pretty good about himself, feeling very powerful. No one's been able to stop him. Again, wars in that sense have ceased. He's starting a big building campaign. Again, the Hanging Gardens is kind of archaeologically that and historically was known as one of the 7 wonders of the world. That's something that happened during King Nebuchadnezzar's reign in terms of putting those together. And so that just kind of gives us some time frame here. Because of his triumphs and supremacy of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar continued to arrogantly take credit for what God alone had granted. And this is what he was missing. He was missing Jeremiah 27, 5 through 8. He was missing what Daniel told him in Daniel chapter 2, that God, the God of heaven, had given Nebuchadnezzar this kingdom, had given him the success that he was going to experience. And so right here in verse 30 is when this 7-year time period is going to happen. So again, I mentioned that in the last lesson, but in 582 BC, 4 years after the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC, we have this incredible governmental silence in the historical records for the nation of the kingdom of Babylon from 582 to 575, exactly 7 years, which is very odd because there's historical governmental records up until 582. It stops for 7 years, and then in 575 it picks up again historically as if nothing had happened. And so the best explanation for that is what we find here in Daniel chapter 4. And so it's been stated before, the greatness of Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom is no secret, being confirmed by both historical writings and archaeological findings. He did have an incredible kingdom. In fact, we know the city of Babylon was surrounded by 8 meters thick, 25-foot thick walls that were decorated with enameled bricks. The walls had 260 towers, each spaced about 50 meters or 160 feet apart. A 7-story temple mound towered above the city. And so I mentioned this earlier, it's disputed by some modern historians, but the city of Babylon was said to have housed hanging gardens, which were considered to be one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Again, from a human perspective, Nebuchadnezzar had a lot to be proud of, for sure. But notice the rapidity of judgment. Okay, we'll look at that. We're going to read verse 31 here in a second. It says, while the word was still in the king's mouth. And then verse 33 we'll read, that very hour the word was fulfilled. And so at some point in time, judgment must be executed when mercy and direct warning are rejected. And see, Nebuchadnezzar had rejected the revelation of this dream, this interpretation from the Lord through Daniel. He had just simply rejected it. And so notice in verse 31, while the word was still in the king's mouth, a voice fell from heaven. King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you. And they shall drive you from men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make you eat grass like oxen, and 7 times shall pass over you until you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he chooses. Verse 33, that very hour the word was fulfilled concerning Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from men and ate grass like oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hair had grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' claws. And so God removed Nebuchadnezzar's ruling authority because he arrogantly took credit for being the mastermind behind Babylon's majesty and greatness. Now, who ruled in Nebuchadnezzar's absence? Well, because we don't have a historical record recorded, we don't know, but it's very likely it could have been Daniel. He was a high-ranking authority in the king's court, along with his 3 Hebrew friends who governed the province of Babylon. Again, we saw that at the end of chapter 2, verse 49. We see at the end there that Daniel sat in the gate of the king. In 3:12, we see that his friends were over the affairs of the province of Babylon. And so maybe it was Daniel and his friends who were ruling. We don't know. And what's interesting is when you look at historical facts, in moments like these, typically in history, especially during this time period of history, if you had a debilitated dictator, he would be immediately killed. And because of his weakness, even Satan might have wanted to see him replaced. But in spite of all this and against amazing odds, no one took Nebuchadnezzar's place. In fact, again, we see that absence of historical record recorded during the 7-year time period in history. And yet, before those 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar's reigning. And when those 7 years are completed, Nebuchadnezzar is reigning again. It's like somebody held his spot for him while he was going crazy and out there with the cattle. And so this fact, I believe, in and of itself, testified to the fact that God is ultimately in control, because an incapacitated dictator who's out acting like an animal and everyone's just waiting for him to return, and they're trying to carry on the business of running an empire without him. And again, this may have been due to Daniel's understanding of the temporary nature of this judgment. You know, if Daniel's in charge, he says, hey, listen, our king is going to be out there for 7 years. We're going to move on business as usual until he's ready. This is just a temporary judgment. It could make sense. It could actually explain that 7-year disappearance of historical record, or non-existence of that historical record, while they waited for him to get back into control, having not recorded it in the official Babylonian records, because they typically didn't record failures or situations that would have embarrassed them. So he records it in his own writing here. And so in Daniel 4:32 through 33, God's, again, purpose for this judgment is stated clearly here. Nebuchadnezzar needed to change his mind about God's supremacy. This is what God is after in the life of Nebuchadnezzar and why he enacted this judgment. And so God's prophetic word was fulfilled, and Nebuchadnezzar became a wild animal. We see that, he ate grass like oxen. He was driven from men. It means he wasn't hanging out in the palace. He was hanging out with the animals outside. His body was wet with the dew of heaven. That meant he slept outside like animals do. And he says that his hair had grown like eagle's feathers and his nails like birds' claws. So he wasn't tending to himself. He wasn't, practicing personal hygiene. He wasn't cutting his nails. He wasn't cutting his hair. He was just a wild animal. Now, there's descriptions of this medically. Zoanthropy is actually a form of mental illness that causes such behavior. And with it, a person imagines himself or herself to be an animal. It's not like they're acting like an animal from time to time, but that they actually view themselves as an animal. And so this is clearly a mental illness, and this could have been something that God afflicted Nebuchadnezzar with. Boanthropy is another form of mental illness that causes a person to think of him or herself to be an ox. And so with boanthropy, the person's outward behavior is irrational, but the inner consciousness remains virtually unchanged. In other words, externally they act and look like an ox, but then they have an inner awareness even still, even though they're acting like an animal. So it's just kind of some unique things that we know are mental illnesses in our day. It could explain what Nebuchadnezzar was going through, or it could have been something unique that God inflicted on Nebuchadnezzar. But these are some things that explain some mental illnesses in our day. So again, we're not certain if Nebuchadnezzar's state was one of these known mental illnesses. But what we do know is that he had some kind of mental consciousness, because this punishment was to last until he changed his mind about his power and the God of heaven. So obviously, if he could change his mind, if he could consider what was happening and kind of understand what was going on with him, to be able to change his mind, then he had some kind of mental consciousness to have the ability to do that. Also notice in verse 34, at the end of this time, it says that he lifted his eyes to heaven. So again, that just reflects this mental recognition of the truth at this point. Also, the fact that it took 7 years for him to realize this shows the depths of his arrogance and pride in this area. So even while he's out there eating grass, living amongst the beasts of the field, just imagine the pride and arrogance it took for him to refuse to acknowledge Yahweh as the supreme ruler over all things. It took him 7 years to finally recognize this and admit this. Just incredible to think of that level of pride. And so in verses 34 through 37, we see Nebuchadnezzar's change of mind, and we see that he'll actually praise Yahweh as the Most High God. Let's read verse 34. Let's read, verses 34 and 35. And at the end of the time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. No one can restrain his hand or say to him, what have you done? And so finally, in what we call a fragile act of faith, Nebuchadnezzar humbly looked up to the sovereign God of the universe. Remember, faith by definition is looking away from yourself to provide a solution outside of your own resources. This is looking to somebody else to provide the solution which you cannot provide for yourself. Nebuchadnezzar could not get himself out of this situation. So what does he do? He lifts his eyes to heaven from where his deliverance would come from. And then we see that immediately his understanding returned to him. God immediately responded with grace. He didn't wait, and make sure, so to speak, or wait and make sure he was serious. He immediately responds with grace toward the king's faith and restored his mind. And immediately, notice the first thing that Nebuchadnezzar does when his understanding returns, he blesses the Most High. And so this, when he regains his sanity and it returned, he broke forth in praise to the Most High God. And so his restoration after 7 long years of being like an animal fulfilled his prophetic dream. Now, Nebuchadnezzar should have known by now that when he had a dream and Daniel gave the interpretation, it was as good as gold. He could have taken that interpretation to the bank, because this is exactly what God does when he wants to communicate and reveals it through his prophet, such as Daniel. So the superior words he previously applied to himself, if you recall back in verse 30, right? It's by his mighty power. It's for the honor of his majesty. Now he aptly applies to God. He's the Most High, and he says he lives forever, right? And he says no one can restrain his hand, down in verse 35. No one can say, what have you done? In other words, he's in charge. You don't mess with him. He's going to do what he wants to do, is kind of the idea. And so pride ultimately makes a person believe that he or she is a demigod. Probably one of the biggest deterrents to pride is gaining an understanding of God's greatness and realizing that our gifts and abilities come only from God's grace. And this is that dose of humility that every successful person should naturally come to on their own, not taking credit and thinking that they're the reason for the success, but it's almost like, I can't believe the success I'm having, considering all the things I'm capable of messing up. There's just got to be a humility that comes with success. And so in verse 35, Nebuchadnezzar's new understanding of God's character now brought him to an accurate view, not only of himself, but also of mankind. Notice again, in verse 35, he recognizes that God is over his kingdom. And then he says, all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. And no one can restrain his hand. So he's got a God-centric view of life and existence now. And he realizes that God's ideas and God's will alone is what matters. And so notice the king's specific comments. Number one, no one can restrain his hand. Yahweh is all powerful. No one can stop anything that he wants to do. This was a miraculous statement of faith, considering the common view of conquering pagan kings, again, was if we take your country captive, then our gods are more powerful than your gods. Now he realizes that had nothing to do with Judah's captivity. Notice what else he says. Or no one can say to him, what have you done? In other words, no one has the right or the position to question anything that Yahweh does. And finally, as we kind of get to the last two verses of Daniel chapter 4 and verse 36, we read, at the same time, Nebuchadnezzar continues to write, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my honor and splendor returned to me. My counselors and nobles resorted to me, and I was restored to my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all of whose works are truth and his ways justice, and those who walk in pride he is able to put down. And so afterward, by God's grace, Nebuchadnezzar once again ruled Babylon. Again, notice all the, and it may not be able to pick this up just on initial reading, but notice all of the passive voice verb descriptions here. My reason returned to me, not I took my reason back, but it was returned to me. Somebody else gave it to me. My honor and splendor returned to me. In other words, God gave it back to me. My counselors and nobles resorted to me. God brought them back to me. I was restored to my kingdom. God restored me to my kingdom. And then excellent majesty was added to me by God. So all of these things reflect his understanding that God was now the one who actually did all these things. So he had learned his lesson. Again, miracle, because as I stated before, in this day and age, if a king was suspected of mental illness, especially 7 years living out in the field with the oxen, somebody would have killed him. And somebody would have laid claim to the throne, but that did not happen in this case. And so a miracle that God was able to just judge him temporarily and then restore him to the position of leadership in the Babylonian kingdom. And then verse 37, we see that the king did not force his faith on his people. He simply praised and honored God before them and provided a testimony of who God is and what he has done. And so, again, we saw this back in verse 17, but the goal of this whole discipline of Nebuchadnezzar was simply this. The sentence, actually verse 17, kind of in the middle, in order that the living may know, not just Nebuchadnezzar, but that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whomever he will, and sets over it the lowest of men. And so by testifying of the greatness of God and testifying and just being honest about this probably very embarrassing portion of his life, Nebuchadnezzar gave testimony to the entire nation of Babylon, the entire empire, in fact, including the nations under them, that there is the Most High God, who's the God of the Jews, Yahweh, and he is the King of heaven. He's the God of heaven. And so this was a great testimony. Now, the question always becomes, did Nebuchadnezzar get saved? I don't know. That's a pretty strong declaration concerning God. I myself would not go out on the edge and say that he finally got it, because he seemed to be a guy that forgot things really quickly. So whether or not he recognized it truly or not, recognize all the details, even with a coming Messiah or somebody, God sending a promised deliverer. We don't know. The details just aren't there in the text, but clearly he desires to give honor, praise, and glory to Yahweh after this event. So that's definitely a positive. Others may have benefited from it. But what's really interesting is when we get to Daniel chapter 5, we're going to fast forward to the time of his grandson. And we're going to see that even though his grandson was probably alive, actually was alive during all of this, he was one of the guys that did not get it. In fact, he's going to need reminding that somebody like Daniel even exists and is a part of the leadership of the kingdom. We'll see that next week as we get into chapter 5. So let me kind of stop sharing my screen right there. Let me just see if anyone has any questions or any comments, I guess, before I close in prayer.
Hey, John.
Yes.
As you were talking about how many years God put up with Nebuchadnezzar, I was just thinking, you look through the Bible at all the different people that God had called to do his bidding, and many Jewish kings were killed, and yet here's a Gentile king that he put up with so much from, even waited 7 years for him to finally acknowledge that it was God who put this kingdom together, not him. It just kind of blows your mind, because it's like, it's kind of like all these people like Esther. She was in a particular place at a particular time, but Mordecai told her, hey, basically, if you don't do anything, God will bring somebody else into the picture to save the Jews.
Right.
Samson, he was, not exactly who I would pick.
Right.
To do God's will. It's amazing to see like these, it's like God never repeats things, that these are all a part of his plan to show us a lesson for us to learn by, but he never like he didn't do Job twice.
Right.
He didn't do Samson twice. He didn't do the flood twice. He didn't do Moses twice. He did them once, but there's a big lesson in each of those teachings. And this one always gets me, that he put up with this king for that long. Yeah.
It's really a testimony to his character and his grace, because obviously Nebuchadnezzar didn't deserve it, but lots of things that God provides us in this stage that we don't deserve, including salvation. So just a good testimony to his character. So yeah, good points.
And that God looks on a man's heart. He's the only one that can see a man's heart and where he can take him.
Yeah, good. Yeah, good point. Anybody else? Any comments or questions? Yeah. Hey, Dean.
Hey, how's it going?
Good, bro. How you doing?
Kathy's got my brain spinning. God always seems to do amazing things on the third day. I can think of a few things top of mind. There's some repeatability there, but it seems like the third day, amazing things happen.
Yeah.
Just a comment.
No, it's exactly right. Good point. Anybody else? All right. Well, I'll take that as a no. So hope that was an enjoyable study tonight. Wanted to just quickly say hello to Anthony and Zion, and thank you guys for being here. Good to see you guys. Good to see you guys on there. Hey, Anthony. And then Sarah, good to see you on here. Hope you're doing well. Welcome from Minnesota. Is it snowing out there yet? I don't know if she's near her mute button, but
no,
not yet.
Snowing yet.
Okay.
It's cold. It's pretty cold though. It's like 30 something.
Oh.
I haven't really looked at the temp, but I like this. I like it. It's good for me.
The weather's good for you? Okay.
Yeah.
Good deal.
It's really hard. It's not good for me. Let's see. It is, talk amongst yourselves. It's 37 and it feels like 31, I guess.
Okay. It's a little bit warmer here. I don't know what it is here, but I was outside in the afternoon sweating a little bit, so it was hot enough to sweat. Yeah. Hey, Zion, did you have something to say or a question?
Yeah, my mom wanted to say something.
Oh, hey, Jasmine.
Hey, how are you?
Hey, good.
I just walked in at the end. That's all.
Okay.
Just want to say hello.
Oh, good. I'm glad you said hello. I'm glad you were there.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I hope maybe I'll see you guys on Wednesday. I'll
Yeah.
as soon as Zion knows his game, have him let me know.
Okay.
All right. Good to see you guys.
Okay. See you.
All right. If we're all done there, let me just close us with a word of prayer, and then we'll go about our night. So thank you guys for coming out. Lord, thanks for the opportunity to study this passage. Just such an incredible passage, unique passage, really, in all of your word. But to see how you govern and reign in the affairs of men, how even when it feels like our government's out of control, to understand that you're still sovereign, you're still in control, you're moving history the direction you desire it to go. So we're just super grateful for that. We can see this even in this story, just an amazing story. We pray that Nebuchadnezzar did trust in you. That would be so cool to see him in heaven one day. But obviously, we're hard to go that far just with the text. But grateful to see your character here, your grace, your love, your mercy, but also your upholding of truth, your desire to be worshipped, and just so many lessons that each one of us can take away even for our own daily lives. So just grateful for this opportunity to study your word. We pray that you would just enrich it to our souls. We pray even this week that as we walk with you, we'd be reminded more and more that everything going on in our life, you want to lead us, you want to provide for us, and you are trustworthy. And so may we just recognize that. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, guys. Everyone have a good night.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks again for coming out.
John.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.